Hey everyone, and welcome to the #1 podcast for everything iOS. From news and how-tos to app and accessory reviews, this is iPhone and iPad Live.
It's May 23rd, 2012. I'm Seth from Nickelfish and Iterate, and joining us tonight is App Cubby's own David Barnard. How you doing, David?
Doing well. A little sleepy, but hanging in there.
That's okay. I'm a little late, so it all works out just fine. And rounding out our panel is the editor-in-chief of imore.com, Rene Ritchie. How are you, Rene?
And I'm grumpy, so we have 3 of the 7 dwarfs just assembled before us.
And of course, our terrific chat room. Say hello, chat room.
Hello, chat room. The chat room is looking very handsome tonight. We have the best-looking chat room in new media.
They are one classy chat room.
Absolutely. Much more attractive than those other network chat rooms that I've seen, mostly because they all run on IRC.
It's because they have a lot of self-respect. You know, a lot of self-esteem, a lot of self-respect.
Nice. So, I'm going to blow through some meta really quickly. Liana is continuing her photo series. This week she did how to take irresistible photos of your pets. So if you have dogs in lieu of children, or dogs and children, or cats, or lobsters, whatever, floats your boat, head on over and check it out. She'll give you all the tips and tricks. Allie did a competitive review, Diet Coda versus Gusto versus Textastic. I just like saying those words. A code editor shootout. So if you're trying to figure out the best way to edit code in FTP on your iPad, that's for you. And Georgia has rounded up the best cases for your iPhone. Everything from LifeProof to OtterBox to CaseMate. Any kind of case you could possibly want, she's got it in there, and she will be adding more. There, Seth, I sprinted.
You did, and that was good. You got through it.
I did. We talk about WWDC now?
Yes.
Nice. So you're going to be there, David, you're going to be there, and I'm going to be there.
Yep.
So who's lining up first?
Oh man, I hate that. I hate that early morning lineup. It's pretty crazy that after paying $1,600 and going to one of the best organized conferences on the planet, you got to get in line at like 2 a.m. to see the keynote live.
It's
Is it really that early?
It's pretty early.
If you want good seats.
Don't tell anybody, but I've cut a few times, and I mean, if I show up at 7 and cut with somebody who got there at 5, we barely made it into the room 2 years ago. I think last year I ended up in the overflow room. So yeah, it's early. It's very early.
Wow.
But we're East Coast time, Seth, so it takes the edge off a little bit.
Hey, so it'll be, we fly in Sunday, so I still won't be fully adjusted, so it might actually work out in my favor.
That's my only single hope in life now. And I'm going to assiduously avoid anything that involves lots of meat the night before, too.
Oh, yeah. Eat light, lots of veggies, a lot of water.
So, Rene, did you get an attendee ticket, or do you have a press pass for the keynote?
I don't think I will get a press pass. I usually get a very polite call at some point telling me that they're booked solid, which I appreciate, but I do have an attendee ticket, and it was actually confirmed this week. Apparently the confirmation did not go through the first time, so when I went to look at the schedule, I got a confirmation email. So I'm lucky I went to look at that schedule. It would have been nervous, but yeah, I'll be there. I'll be lining up super early. And Apple, speaking of it, the Apple actually put out the schedule, and it was a bit of a surprise because they have the keynote on Monday, and then right after that, they have what used to be State of the Mac, and now I forget what it's called. Is that the kickoff now?
Yeah, it's very different. Last year, all day Monday, they would typically have what they would call like the State of the Union. So like State of the Mac, State of Safari, State of iOS. And not being a coder, those were some of my favorite talks. So I'm kind of curious to see how this year goes for me, since they're not going to have those.
It's like, well, Monday is going to be a very general purpose day. I mean, you have the public keynote, which we're guessing is Tim Cook, Phil Schiller, Scott Forstall, maybe some people from the Mac team. I'd love a Jonathan Ive appearance, but I've learned not to hold to hope for that.
He doesn't seem to like to be on stage.
I think the last time was the Unibody MacBook. I think that's the last time he was at a keynote. But he was fantastic. I mean, he's a fantastic speaker. They would do well to have him there. And then they have sorry?
He just comes off as very, very shy, though. Even as good as he is, it seems like it's a lot of work to to pull it off as well as he does. He just seems like a very shy person. He doesn't like to be on stage. So, but we're sure gonna miss Steve. Speaking of people who liked to be on stage, he was sure in his element.
Is it? I mean, this is the thing, Seth. I mean, people look. I was there the first year that Steve Jobs didn't do a keynote. The Macworld, I think it was Apple's last Macworld keynote, and it was Phil Schiller, and he was incredibly affable. And on any other stage, he would have been an utterly fantastic corporate speaker. But it was sort of like when you're the first guy to see Van Halen, when Sammy Hagar has taken over.
Yeah, I mean that's just it, right? The band is still awesome. Everybody else still absolutely blows your mind, but you're like, it's kind of not the same.
Where's Roth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be sad. I mean, this is my first WWDC, and I just could not make it to the other ones in the past, and that's probably partially true and partially me making myself feel better for not making more of an effort to make it to WWDC in the past, but I did think about it yesterday, actually, where I was like, man, I'm not going to get that. I'm never going to have that chance to see that or have that kind of like awesome.
Dude, I've been to, this will be my third or my fourth. Every single one I've actually gotten into has not had Steve Jobs there.
Oh, all right. Well, I guess I don't feel as bad then.
I was actually called a curse by several people in the smartphone industry.
Lovely.
But again, like these it's going to be a fantastic keynote. We have heard once again there's not going to be any hardware for iOS. There might be Mac stuff, and we can talk about that because David did a fantastic post on those. But we heard there will not be iOS hardware this summer again. But I'm fine with that because WWDC is more developer, more focused, more software. It was kind of odd that they had iPhones there for a while, I think.
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, being the premier platform, and especially the early years of the iPhone when they were quickly and continually iterating the hardware, to me it made a little more sense to see it at WWDC when you got, a new camera with new camera APIs, and you got, the accelerometer was, I guess, in the first one, but then they added the gyroscope. And so, those were new APIs related to the hardware. The front-facing camera was new hardware that, we got API access to. And so, in some ways, I think it made a lot of sense to kind of kick off the week with the hardware announcement and then, talk about all these new APIs related to the hardware. But I think, now we're probably going to see a much slower iteration of the hardware. I don't anticipate any new big gizmos or any new big hardware-related APIs. And that being the case, I think delaying the hardware announcement later makes a lot of sense. I mean, think of the 4S. We didn't get any new hardware, and so they could pretty much announce everything at WWDC with iOS 5, and there's no big deal. So I think that's why it made sense, especially the 3GS, and the 4 were both announced at WWDC. Yeah. Maybe the 3G too, huh?
Yep, 3G as well.
Mm-hmm. So, but see, every single one of those revisions had some pretty significant hardware changes.
And Siri was only shown off in October, but there were no APIs for Siri, so it didn't really matter.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and there could be Macs. Do you think there might be Retina Macs? Is that too early, David, or are we poised for a retinization?
Man, I have no idea. I mean, I wrote my little blog post about OS 10 at 2x. Theorizing that in order to ship and make it affordable, they could lower the resolution and then double it versus assuming they had to double every single resolution. Because, on such a large screen, if you took a couple of the 133 DPI screens or PPI, whatever screens, and you double those to 266, that's an incredibly dense screen. And I'm just not sure they can ramp up production with that large and that high of density. So if they took a 100 PPI screen and doubled that to 200, it just seems a lot more feasible. So I think if we do see something announced at WWDC, it's not going to be some crazy like 300 PPI screen. But Apple surprises, so you just never know. But that's what I'd put my money on, is if we see it, it's going to be a Rev 1. I mean, it may even kind of be, they may initially do it like in the iMac and the MacBook Pro.
Yeah.
And just kind of target it at developers. So it's kind of clear, like they release it at WWDC. It's, kind of the pro versions, and maybe not even the iMac, maybe just the 27-inch cinema display, or maybe they release a new 24-inch high definition cinema display. So I think whatever they do, this is going to be a very like kind of first gen and much more kind of pro focused. I doubt we'll see a huge consumer push, but who knows? Apple always surprises, so we'll see.
They could surprise everyone by dumping new Macs in a press release the night before, as they have done on several occasions beforehand. Or Seth, do you think that's a big enough change that they'd want to show off, slimmer, sexier, higher def Macs?
I think if it had a Retina panel, that warrants its own kind of thing. I think that's such a quantum leap for mainstream computing that I think they're gonna showcase that in its own event. I couldn't see them doing that at WWDC, and I started to think about this last night. Actually, when you look at the Retina iPad and you look at a web page on it, and the text looks pretty darn good, and then you look at the ads and stuff on the side, you can kind of get an idea of what it's going to be like to use a Retina Mac for a while. Your applications and text are going to be pretty sharp, but then everything else is going to take a really long time to catch up. And while that may not be really alluring to people like us who really focus on that stuff, that's probably not going to be a problem for the public at large. And more importantly, it's not going to be a problem for Apple because they're basically not going to celebrate those things that don't look good. They're going to celebrate the things that do look good, and they're going to show off all the apps that look absolutely amazing and how great Final Cut looks and how great iPhoto looks and all those things. So I think we'll see one sooner than later, but I don't think we're going to see one in 2 weeks.
Interesting. Yeah, so it could be a hardware-free WWDC like last year. Before we get to iOS, iCloud, we saw hints of photo sharing, video sharing, notes and reminders taken to the cloud. I think those are good small steps. I think Apple's going to take it slow with iCloud, not do anything crazy. I don't think they need a web storefront the way Google has it, because you can buy on device and buy on iTunes. So I don't know if you need apps from the web to the device. Any big holes you're still experiencing in iCloud, David? Maybe like Game Sync or something?
No, but a huge hole. And honestly, I would hesitate to make such a bold prediction, but if Apple doesn't do some sort of sharing very soon, some kind of collaboration, some kind of multiple accounts sharing data, I think they're going to continue. I think they're going to continue to have a hard time enticing developers. I mean, iCloud makes a lot of sense for little things like, Tweetbot Sync and things like that. And there's some apps that it does, relatively well. But as soon as you start thinking about, 90% of the apps that do well with cloud stuff, you need that sharing component. So, I really want to put iCloud in my app Gas Cubby. But a ton of people use the app to share among multiple devices. Yeah. So husband and wife share a car, and you can't share iCloud's data. And so, right now, iCloud is rough enough around the edges that I think a lot of developers are either, avoiding it, or, I see tweets all the time of people banging their head against, Xcode, trying to get these iCloud things working. But, there hasn't been, robust enough debugging tools. There hasn't been, these sharing features. And so, as a developer, I look at that, and then I look at the continually, lowering cost and third-party services to enable a separate back end. And to me, that's a much more attractive solution, even though Apple's providing so much for free. So, I desperately want to see some kind of sharing. And if not for me as a developer, just for me as a user, it drives me nuts that my wife's phone can't share photo sync because, or what's it called? The iCloud
photo stream.
Yeah, photo stream. That we can't share photo stream. And we're both taking pictures of our kids, and we can't cross that data. And even right now, the way a lot of people don't even realize that you can share contacts and not share calendars, or share calendars and not contacts, and reminders and not calendars. But setting all that up is pretty fiddly. I'd love to see in iOS 6 some kind of more robust social kind of sharing, where you can set up that kind of sharing stuff much more easily, and have some APIs to make it much easier for developers to integrate that into our apps. So long rant, but that's just something that bugs the heck out of me about iCloud.
Well, it's kind of odd that it's iCloud is one of those rare things where it sounds like Apple built the infrastructure and then started pushing out solutions instead of looking at the problems they wanted to solve and then building the technology to do it. And maybe that's just because Apple is not a traditional cloud company the way they're not a traditional social networking company. But it behooves them to learn, especially, Seth, because stuff like Dropbox is still so engaging.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. They're not really a cloud company. They're a company that does a lot of things really well, and they happen to have cloud services with that. And comparing it to Dropbox is key for people like us, because Dropbox not only enables a level of storage and kind of granularity that we tend to really enjoy, but there are so many amazing plugins with it, and there's so many amazing ways to share out of Dropbox, and just it has a lot of really great web juice where you can do like photo galleries and things like that, and it's grown into a really robust service. And iCloud is one of those things that seems on a consumer to consumer level very interesting and very exciting to individuals, but for groups of people it has a long way to go. I mean, I would very much love to see, and I know this is ridiculous, but I would love to be able to do like iCloud for Business, where there's, a much more robust iCloud setup that enables us to do all the calendar sharing and all the collaboration stuff that we currently do with Google Apps, just because, we're on all Macs and 95% of us have iPhones.
Lion server in the cloud.
Yeah, like I want that so much, because it would just be so much more integrated and so much more enjoyable to use that it hurts me every day when I don't have it.
Why are you making me use Google? Why?
But
well, and what's really odd too, I mean, Apple acknowledged like 3 years ago that people want to share documents. So, I work in the cloud. Wasn't that
iWork.com beta?
Yeah, iWork.com. There you go. And it never came out of beta.
No.
But it's like they acknowledge that, hey, people want to collaborate on documents, and it's not a one-to-one thing. And so to me, iOS 5 and iCloud was all about laying the foundation for the next generation of mobile devices that don't need a computer. And you can't work in iCloud as an island and not be able to collaborate back and forth. I mean, that's just completely unrealistic to think that, people are just going to have their iCloud account and their iCloud document, their iWork documents are going to sync between their iPad and their iPhone, and that's it. I mean, that's not how people work. And so, it seems like that's a huge hole, not only for the cloud services aspect, but even from their own apps. Somebody was asking me recently specifically about that, and I told them, well, numbers is really great, but if you're going to collaborate on something, you really probably have to do it on your computer and put it in Dropbox, and then from Dropbox, open it on the iPad. And it's horrible.
Is it no coincidence maybe that both Google and Microsoft built their latest versions of cloud storage on their Docs platform? So you have Office in the cloud built into with SkyDrive built into it, and the new Google storage it's basically Google Docs Plus.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's how people work. It's how people collaborate. And for as much as you would say, iOS is not as much about work, but more about the consumer space. I mean, we're even talking, building a little flyer for your kid's birthday and things like that. I mean, there, so many of those kind of productivity things are collaborative, whether it's work or play or whatever. And so, yeah, I definitely think it's no coincidence, and Microsoft and Google definitely have a leg up at the moment on Apple. So it'll be interesting to see what they think.
iLife and iWork in the cloud. Make it happen.
For real.
All right, so shifting into, we contemplate, we speculate there will be iOS 6 at WWDC because there was iOS 5 last year, and because unlike the years before that, there was no separate iOS SDK event. There's a school, I'm working on one of those massive all-nighter articles again tonight, so I have this on my brain right now. But there's a school of thought that there's no more low-hanging fruit, that Apple has filled the gaps that existed when they originally launched the iPhone. But looking around, I think there's still some slightly higher hanging fruit that Apple could definitely take advantage of. I'll just ask both of you to start with. Maybe Seth, you can start. What are your pain points still in iOS, and what do you hope that Apple addresses?
The two that I still identify are switching between apps and integration with data between apps. Switching between apps with the multitasking fast app switcher tray thing is functional, but it's not great. It's not a really elegant implementation. It's not even a very intuitive implementation. So that's something that, I'd love to see some way to move between apps in a more fluid manner that makes more sense as you're using the phone. Because essentially, if the phone, if the device becomes the app and everything else falls away when you're using it, having to hit that home button, not just to go home, but to actually jump between apps is, to get overly critical, it's disorienting because you're now coming out of the app and you're dealing with the hardware as opposed to the software, which is really where you want to be and where your brain really is spending the majority of its time. That's one thing I'd like. The other thing I'd like is sharing stuff between apps. Obviously now you have certain files that you can kind of press and hold on, and you get your open in action sheet dialog where you can throw it to another app. But we've talked a lot, many times about how Windows Phone has contracts where you can send data between apps. They can share it openly. Android obviously has similar things where if a certain app is installed, depending on the action you're taking or the file that you're manipulating, you can throw it from one place to another very easily. That kind of fluidity of data movement between applications and just, stuff from one place to another, those are the two things that really, I think, would make a huge difference in iOS 6, and those are probably not consumer-facing things that are very important to Apple, but if we're done talking about low-hanging fruit, I think those are things that we can talk about because they're not the kinds of things that people will focus on, but I think they'll enhance the overall experience if they're done well.
David?
Well, can I comment on Seth's?
Sure.
Real quick.
It's your mic, sir.
Thank you. So I've been thinking a ton about the home screen because we're building, Launch Center Pro, which is kind of a reimagined Launch Center with a whole new app launch experience. And so we've been thinking about Springboard a lot over the past 5 months now. I guess we launched Launch Center back in December. So the challenge with the home screen and app switching and everything else is that as limiting as it seems, the home button and the current Springboard is such a refined implementation of finding and launching apps. Now, it's not refined for 300 apps, but it's incredibly refined for 2 to 3 pages of apps and maybe a folder or two. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, that's the target market. My mom, my dad, my brother who's pretty tech savvy but not uber nerd, and so we all sit here, the uber nerds, and say what Apple can and should and shouldn't do. But at the end of the day, what they have to look at is, can somebody walk into an Apple store, pick up an iPhone, and have, some relative understanding of how to launch apps and get out, and launch an app and get out, and launch an app and get out. And they've solved that incredibly well. And so even the app switching, I don't think they've solved that very well, but what they've done is kind of hidden the feature. Yeah. And so what you were saying about it not being very intuitive is kind of in some ways okay, because it's not intended to be incredibly intuitive, because it really is kind of an advanced user hack. So that being said, I think that we may see some really cool stuff regarding app switching, but it will continue to be a little bit unintuitive, just in the sense that they're not going to break Springboard to make something like that happen. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, they were so specific about saying they made the iPad like the iPhone because hundreds of millions of people already knew how to use it. So obviously they consider familiarity as a feature to be a key for iOS.
Oh yeah, and we've said here, and I believe on Iterate too, that the Springboard will be the last thing to change, because too many people have mentally mapped that stuff, and that is how they understand these devices. That one-to-one tap an icon, get in, get out analogy is ingrained in people now. So I would definitely agree with you, in as much as Springboard is relatively untouchable for the short term.
Well, there might be some alternate skins for it floating around at Apple, just different colors and looks and things, but the mechanics, I think, are hard to change.
There might be, or there might be, or there are.
There might be. You never know. I mean, Apple is such a dynamic company. They can say no, not 10 ideas, 3 prototypes, 1 release.
Right.
David,
yeah, I'm sure there's prototypes of all sorts of stuff floating around inside Apple. I'd love to be a fly on the wall there for a couple weeks and just get a sense of how many ideas and iterations and stuff flies around before they ship that one incredibly polished implementation.
I think Gruber said that even as back as iOS 2 or 3, there was an alternate Springboard that they were testing, decided not to go with. So I mean, they obviously have options, but they're so proud of saying no to things that, and rightly so.
Yeah, and just to let you get back to it, I totally agree with you that the multitasking is a advanced user hack, but just like folders are there if people want to use them and discover them, I think that multitasking and fast app switching is there if people want to discover it, but I just don't think it's done as well as it could be. So I agree with you completely, but I still would love to see something different.
So let me ask you this, David, because Apple is very different. Google has all the widgets everywhere. WebOS had the cards. Apple seems not to care about information density on the home screen. They do not consider the home screen to be a hangout place, but it's absolutely, like you said, an app launcher. You get in, you find your app. They want you spending your time in apps. So if that's their focus, there probably wouldn't be a switch to anything Android-like or WebOS-like, or even the new style BlackBerry or Windows Phone style.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. That it's hard to imagine Apple changing Springboard in a very significant way, and that being the case, Notification Center seems to be the kind of information dense widgety area, and there's nice aspects to it. I'm fiddling with it right now. The fact that it's available system wide, that it just pulls down over what you're doing, and a quick swipe sends it back up. But Notification Center is completely overwhelmed within a few minutes of tweets and emails and other things. And so I think that's, as much as everybody said last year that it was low-hanging fruit for them to do something like Notification Center, I think it is still low-hanging fruit for them to do something better with Notification Center.
Yeah.
And and so I think, like Seth was saying, I think multitasking is similar. It's like we have a multitasking implementation, but they can definitely do something better with it. So I would love to see kind of Notification Center 2.0. And if they do that, I think it does make sense to be the place where you have that information density. I would love to see, widgets and other things enabled in Notification Center. But honestly, if all they do is just put widgets in Notification Center, I wonder how handy it really will be. Just given what a mess it can get very quickly.
That's one of the things I wanted more than widgets, was to have actionable Notification Center. So if I got an SMS, I could tap it, and instead of being ripped out of the app I'm in and sent to messages, I could just quickly type in a reply there, hit send,
Yes.
and stay in the same app. Or the way Siri has that alarm widget, if an alarm's going off, instead of me having to go to alarm to turn it off or have a pop-up, I could have just the nice Siri alarm widget come down as a notification and I could turn it off. I think there's a lot they could do to not necessarily take app information or app data and stick it on the home screen, but bring it into other apps so that once I'm in, they've launched me into the app, I don't have to go jumping around in them quite so much.
Yeah, and that actually goes right back to what Seth was saying. His number 2 was, integration among apps. Apple since 2.0 and the launch of the App Store has had a very specific, very clear apps are an island kind of approach, and URLs being pretty much the only window into these little fortresses of apps. So I think similarly it is low hanging fruit for them to do something meaningful there, to do some kind of contracts, expanded URL support. All of which I would love, working on Launch Center.
Are you asking to be Sherlocked? Is that the first time in history that's happened?
Be careful what you ask for.
No. Here's what's really interesting. And I mean, there's very few things that ever get truly Sherlocked. I mean, Sherlock is about the only thing I can think of in recent memory that actually got Sherlocked. Because I mean, reminders, everybody joked like, Sherlocking things and OmniFocus and stuff. How many people really use reminders? And I'm sure, we could ask the developers of to do apps if reminders hurt them. And I would guess not.
Well, that's the Marco and Reader, Safari Reader question, right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
I actually love reminders, by the way.
Well, reminders are good for certain things, but it's not, it's totally not the ultimate. And so that's the thing. And that's exactly what I was going to say is that, we very consciously with this new version of Launch Center, we're calling it Launch Center Pro, and we're taking a very kind of advanced user hacky kind of approach to development. And not that, I mean, we've tried to approach it as much as we can that anybody could become familiar and use it. But we're also trying not to sacrifice too much in the way of functionality just so that, my 56-year-old mom can grok it, And so the thing about any Apple implementation is that they're going to have to do what makes sense to everybody.
Yeah.
And so if Launch Center, quote unquote, got Sherlocked, I think it would actually be better for business because it would introduce these concepts, and then we could do it in a way that all of us nerds will be incredibly excited about, even if the average user still uses Apple stuff. So I'm not at all worried about getting Sherlock.
To make a horrible analogy, Apple likes to skim the froth off the top, the mainstream froth off the top, and leave the hard liquor or the hot coffee for the dedicated few.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the things that I would like to see, and this is something that still drives me batty, and Gary Mazzo wrote an article about this for us a while ago, is something like WebOS Synergy. I would love for Apple to be able to take all the accounts I have, whether they're Gmail or iCloud or Facebook or Twitter, contain them all in silos in the background, and then present me a unified view. So I could have all of David's or all of Seth's profiles from whatever systems they use. iOS would handle that and present me with a unified card that just had all of David's information and unified messages where I could see his latest email to me, his latest SMS, his latest status update, whatever it was, in a sane manner. And Palm solved this years ago very elegantly. I think they went far more open than Apple would do, but I would just love to have that dream unified contact messaging system. I think that fruit still dangles towards the ground.
Yeah, people is something that iOS has never done particularly well, in a variety of ways. And even what I was saying earlier about iCloud sharing is the kind of thing that a more unified, robust, people app. I don't know if it would just be the Contacts app, and that's kind of what's been weird about iOS is that you don't really have this like people app.
Yeah.
You have the phone app, which has contacts, and then you have the Contacts app, which is a separate thing, but it's pretty much just the phone app. And then, so yeah, I mean, that's another gray area where I think Apple can make some huge improvements and spread that throughout the entire OS. Because once you have that that true people app that unites, those different things, then you can do some really cool stuff with, that could be where you set up your sharing. So, I want to share my calendar with my wife, but I don't want to share my contacts. Shouldn't that be a part of her, not some like setting buried deep within settings of, how I'm sharing things?
Yep.
And so yeah, I think, especially in combination with what I was talking about with sharing in iCloud, I think that'd be a huge improvement.
Seth?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, I mean, even Windows Phone, I don't mean to say even Windows Phone, but Windows Phone has a people hub. They have all the social elements. They have all the messaging elements built in there. Yeah. It seems like an area that Apple... and I'll also add to David's previous point about notifications. Why can't I decide to... Tweetbot will let me turn off notifications at night, but the OS won't. BlackBerry has incredibly granular. Chris Parsons was explaining them to me for this post that I'm writing, where you can pick different notifications for people and times and places, like work and home, mother compared to wife, day compared to night. I think there's still a lot of room for improvements in all those kind of people-centric areas.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, we've talked about this too. I've gone on record and said that, the social integration in WebOS and that synergy stuff is phenomenal. It's one of my favorite things about the operating system. I think that's one of those things that Apple definitely could integrate in a really interesting way, especially with, the low-level stuff they've got going with Twitter. Obviously, Tim intimated last night that, things with Facebook could be developing. And if that's the case, those are, let's just call them the two major social networks on the planet right now. I think that's fairly accurate. And you could have them really, really well integrated at a low level in the operating system. I think that's definitely appealing to people. And I think that's something that kind of comes back to the apps sharing data back and forth more fluidly. If you have more ways to get things out of your apps in the way that you want them to go, and it's not like jumping through hoops individually in each app. Like, one of the things that makes me crazy is just the idea that I have to leave a certain app to send data to another app to do the thing that I want to do, when I know that app is like the last app that I open. They're basically sitting next to each other in the tray, and all I need is one service from one app to interact with another one.
God help you, if you start an email and later decide to attach something.
Oh, that's perfect example. Perfect example. The fact that you can't throw pictures into an email after you've started writing it, but you can then go to the Photos app. You can copy your text and then go to the Photos app, click your share button, do all your 5 pictures, and then, it's ridiculous. At this point, those kinds of things are the kinds of things that really will reduce the friction within the operating system. And I think those are the kinds of things that ultimately people don't notice. Like, regular people are not going to say to their friends, oh my God, it's so much better because now you can do X, Y, and Z. But those are the things that delight people when everything just works together. And, as much as we want to dissect it at a ridiculously geeky level, those are the things that please people. So definitely that level of social integration, huge.
Well, that's I try to base a lot of this on the questions we get from people who have switched to iOS, and they email us and go, I must be missing something, because certainly you should be able to do X, Y, Z. And then I have to sheepishly go, no, well, you can sort of do it this way, but you really shouldn't. You've been told not to do that.
Well, see, it's like this.
The other one that I was kind of thinking about, and if you look at what iOS is trying to do, Apple has never tried to win the feature checklist. When they launched iOS, it had nowhere near the features of Palm OS, Windows Mobile, or Symbian at the time, but people were willing to throw those features away and go with the iPhone because it worked and looked like the future. And they chose multi-touch and stuff like that ahead of all the fancy, well, not fancy, but utilitarian things you could do in other operating systems. We have seen gestures in BlackBerry 10. We have gestures on the iPad. Gestures are a terrific way for advanced users to have faster functionality. Should those come to the iPhone? Should you be able to slide sideways to peek at your messages or swipe instead of using the fast app switcher? And I'll go to David first, because there's this whole argument about discoverability versus power usage. Is there a trade-off to be made?
You're just baiting me, aren't you?
Well, no, 'cause, honestly, we did it. We did a roundtable on this with Josh Clark and Phil Ryu, and I couldn't get you onto it. So this was deliberately set up to kind of get your opinion on it.
Yeah, I haven't listened to that roundtable yet. I'm really looking forward to. Have y'all released it yet?
Yes.
Yep.
Just did. It's the last one.
I need to. Okay, I need to go check it out. And I've actually sat down with Josh a couple of times and had some long discussions. That there are just a lot of problems with gestures, a lot of problems, and the problems aren't just discoverability. So here's a great example. If you launch the Reminders app and in the Reminders app, you can actually swipe left and right to go among cards. Those of you with your iPhone handy can follow along. The problem is when you have a vertical scroll bar, a vertical scrolling content active, and then you try and hack on these horizontal gestures, about 50% of the time, I end up swiping up and down instead of left and right.
Yeah, gesture collisions.
Yep.
Yeah, gesture collisions are huge.
It's like when people try to use the iPad and end up going from Fruit Ninja into email.
Right. Yeah, my son does that constantly. He'll put too many fingers on the screen and just close an app. And that's the thing is that, there's so many great apps, especially for kids, where they try and engage as many fingers as they can. And so if you're in the app intentionally engaging the fingers and intentionally, creating your own gesture layer, trying to do it at the OS level is incredibly problematic. And then, excuse me. So then the other problem is, when I picked up the BlackBerry for the very first time, it took me about 20 minutes to figure out how to app switch and how to do all that. I think I eventually had to read the placard or ask one of the attendants. Now, that's not a huge barrier to entry, right? I mean, if these are very core system functionality things, I don't think you have to be able to for those things to be imminently grokkable.
Well, it's like Steve Jobs with the first iPhone introduction. He shows you pinch to zoom, and it's such a cool demo. You go show all your friends pinch to zoom, and it just spreads.
Right. So if gestures are taught in that way, you can have these kind of gestures. So back to the problems, though. On the iPhone specifically, you can't really do edge gestures. So Notification Center is already pretty much the edge gesture. So about the only thing you could do is create an edge gesture to pull up the multitasking. And that's something I could see them doing, swiping up from the bottom to enable the multitasking instead of having to double click the home button. I would imagine they tested that, though, and there were some problems with that implementation.
I've tried to draw on paper, and when I try to strike upwards just to draw, I end up getting the palette come up instead.
Yeah. Exactly.
And think of how many apps have navigation at the bottom,
Yeah. Well, but even then, I mean, so edge gestures are particularly interesting because if you actually detect coming fully off the screen to fully on the screen, I think, that can eliminate a lot of the collision stuff. And part of what's great about Notification Center is that more often than not, you actually have the status bar up top. And so you kind of have that little bit of a buffer. And so that is part of the problem with the bottom, is that if you have tabs and other navigation on the bottom, it gets a lot more tricky with the gesture collisions. But then back to edge gestures, is that on the iPhone, you pretty much can't have a left and a right edge gesture because there's just not enough bezel to be able to actually come from off screen to on screen and be able to detect that fluidly. And then another problem with the iPhone, and the reason we don't see the same multitasking gestures on the iPhone as there are on the iPad, is because it's really hard to do anything with more than two fingers. Yeah. And so we already have so many gestures mapped to two fingers, the best of which is the pinch to zoom gesture. So layering more and more gestures on top of that is going to be incredibly difficult, both ergonomically and discoverability and gesture collision and stuff. And I could go on and on about this, and I really should just write a post about singing the praises of buttons.
We're gonna have to have you back on Iterate because Mark didn't do a good job as button man. You'd be much better.
He didn't.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the thing about a touch screen is that unlike a mouse, we're incredibly adept at using our fingers to, the mechanical precision with which we move our arms and fingers is incredible. And the mouse was an abstraction of that. Here you're moving your hand and or finger on a trackpad or mouse, and you have this, random cursor moving around on the screen. So, that was a huge abstraction. But what the iPhone did and what touchscreens do is they remove that huge abstraction layer to where, with your finger touching directly on the screen, it's an incredibly intuitive, incredibly quick action. So, and I've actually written about this before, but if you think about it on a computer, the difference between recognizing something and taking action, you could recognize something much more quickly than you could take action, because you would see a button on screen and then it takes a long time to navigate the mouse up to where you want to click. On a touch screen, it's almost the exact opposite, that recognizing what you need to do can often take far, far longer than actually doing it. The speed and precision with which you can move your thumb on a touch screen is pretty incredible. So all that being said, gestures and as an abstraction of touch can be helpful, and they can be the keyboard shortcuts, yada, 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 yada. However, I think that there's something inherently great about, and actually I have a blog post that is going to go up in the morning along with my new app that just got approved, by the way.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so there's something incredibly intuitive and functional about just having big buttons. and the thing is, for all if you look at what it takes to swipe around and to do these gestures, buttons can often be faster. And so we talk about gestures being the keyboard shortcuts. On the iPad, it can get really tricky, because if you have, if you're sitting there reading and you're holding it in your hands and there's a button way up in the top left, and you actually have to let go of the screen and move your hand all the way across, that can become burdensome and slow things down. So on the iPad, I think, some gestures make more sense, but especially on the iPhone, having a big button to do something, it's not just intuitive, because you can, put text on the button and make the button really clear, but it's just so easy to actually do. And even pinch and zoom, maps actually drives me nuts, because at least I don't know, is there some kind of a shortcut to zoom out in maps? Because getting two fingers on the screen when you're using it one-handed is ridiculously complicated. And so, zooming out in maps is a perfect example where a gesture fails me so often, because I'm looking at a map, even driving, and I look down and I just want to zoom out real quick to get a bigger picture, and have to set the iPhone down, or try and use two hands while I'm trying to.
I don't know if this happens to you guys, but I have a problem with scrubbers where I always scrub to just the perfect place, and then as I let go, my finger moves just enough to change the place considerably.
Yeah. Don't even get me started on that.
Seth, I know you spoke for about an hour and a half on gestures already, but do you want to put a button on that one before we move on?
I think David actually covered a lot of the best points as to why they don't make sense, and why buttons still work in many cases. But I still think that on the iPad, they're turned off by default and they're enabled in settings. And I don't see why Apple can't start doing this for more things. Like, don't put them on by default. Don't make people trip over them. But for people who want to experiment, who are willing to go into settings and say, what else can I do? And, allow some things to be enabled. And then when you turn them on, go through like a quick little 2-screen tutorial as to like, here are the things you can do. Ready, go. Like when you open a new laptop with Lion on it, the first thing that you have to do is do the stupid scrolling tutorial. And the second thing I do is turn off the stupid reverse scrolling because I never got used to it.
It's called natural scrolling for a reason.
There's nothing natural about it.
Ah.
Listen. When you are physically touching your glass screen of your phone and seemingly manipulating the information up and down, my brain works that way. I can see myself tugging from the bottom and going up. When I'm on my laptop, I tried to do it and I couldn't do it. I really tried.
Doing it right now in spite of you. I'm just pushing Safari up with my trackpad.
That's okay. Spite me all you like.
See, I don't use a mouse. I use a magic. I almost always use trackpads and magic trackpads.
But I mean, just to put the final point on it for me, as far as I'm concerned, bury them in settings. Let people have them if they want. Don't enable them by default. Keep the general user understanding as to how the phone works consistent, but allow these things to be extensible for people who really want to play with it.
So here's an example. So BlackBerry 10, if you're just holding BlackBerry 10 is trying to find a way to have one-handed ease of use on large screen devices. Because for example, on a 4.8-inch Android device, it's very hard to get your thumb to the top of the screen to pull down the notification shade. So what BlackBerry is doing is your hand's on the side of the screen and you gesture bezel in a little bit and it pulls up a vertical notification bar, and you can just peek at your notifications. And if you keep the same gesture going, it pulls up your messages, no matter where you are in the operating system. And if you go the opposite way, it pulls up your app launcher. So they're trying to allow you to have both the big screen and through gestures have layered transitional interface to get the stuff. But they very clearly say they're targeting a pro-level user, and it's not, for my sister who uses her iPhone as a camera phone that plays music.
So another problem, and I'll try and do this briefly. I'm sure we could do another roundtable, or I should just blog about it when I get the time. but another huge issue is being able to mentally map these gestures. So
yeah,
the thing is, we want to do complex things with our apps. We're kind of beyond just tapping something out real quick. I mean, we're talking about sharing among apps and doing all these other things. And so, if all we did on our devices was, had a digital notepad that we just, took notes on and a few other little very minor things, you could map gestures to these very common things and have that consistent across apps. But at this point, with 600,000 apps in the store, with probably 25,000 decent apps in the App Store.
Wow, you went high.
You have such an incredible variety and functionality in user experience, in even just the mapping of functionality. And so when you try, and if you look at Clear, which I mean, they did an incredible job. I love the app. But here's the problem: is a lot of the things that they did aren't things that can map naturally to other apps. So yes, they can build a little to-do list app and minimize the feature set to a point where they can get away with no buttons. And even that's not true, because some things act as a button, even if you don't call it a button. But as they try and add features, it's made a lot of money, and they've talked about things, and I'm sure as they've thought, okay, let's make this a bigger deal. They've hinted at maybe doing a Mac app or an iPad app and other things like that. If they wanted to do social sharing, if they wanted to do, if they wanted to start expanding their app to do more of what people have come to expect, and there's a debate right there. I mean, there's if Clear never changed and was exactly what it is, I think there's something to be said for it working well as is. But as soon as you start, going beyond that, I mean, look at an app like Tweetbot. I mean, it's ultimately a very complex app, and they do a very good job through the use of buttons and a few gestures here and there to simplify it as much as they possibly can. But it's ultimately a very complex app. So if you think about an app like Tweetbot and trying to do that only with gestures, I mean, it's impossible. And if you look at some of the gestures in Clear and you tried to map those to Mail or tried to map those to Tweetbot or any multiple apps, they're not going to map well to those gestures. And so as you start building this mental map of gestures in your head, if you switch from Clear, which pinch to zoom means one thing, and switch to another one and pinch to zoom means something completely different, that's actually one gesture I think Clear did pretty well, because pinch to zoom, and then you can mentally map that to zooming into another one. But and I wish I had notes on this. I didn't know we were going to actually talk about this, but the point being, I think once you try and map these kind of gestures across multiple apps, and as a swipe means one thing in one app and a swipe means something in another. And Josh Clark talks about this a lot. It's like we need a gesture language. The problem is there's such a diversity in apps that trying to come up with this language that makes sense across all apps. And I think that's why Apple still is struggling with even the multitasking gestures on the iPad.
Because you also have the system gestures colliding with the app gestures at that point.
Exactly. So you have so Apple, I think, is already having a hard time trying to map the system gestures, which is why it's off by default. And so, if you're talking about creating a language of gestures, I think there are some things that can be done, and I think it can be done well, but it's
non-trivial.
It's non-trivial, and it's often, much better to focus on a great button UI than to try and
Are you making an analogy to the Russians bringing a pencil into space?
No.
That's that old joke where the America spent $1 million making a pen that could write upside down, and the Russians just took a pencil.
Oh, yeah. That's a great analogy. Yeah.
The last thing I want to ask you guys about, because I want to make sure we fit this in, is the latest rumor about WWDC, and that is that we might be seeing APIs for Apple TV apps. This has long been a dream since the Apple TV went iOS, probably before it went iOS even. We're running really short on time, so I'll just get your quick takes on that. Seth, do you think there'll be Apple TV apps? And if so, what would you like to see?
I think if there are going to be Apple TV apps, they're going to be not a focal point, because obviously iOS 6 is the thing that will be driving the next year for Apple, even more so than OS 10. So I think that iOS 6 is definitely going to be the focus. I think Mountain Lion will be after that. If there are Apple TV integrations, I think it's probably going to... See, I could almost see that being a separate announcement that comes with, content deals and things like that, and possibly even new hardware at some point, because now when did they re-release the new Apple TV? Was it last fall?
It was March with the iPad 3.
Oh, it was March. Okay. Yeah, so maybe there will be something. I just don't think it's going to be a big focal point. I think if anything, it's going to be very small scale and very slow starting, because it's still not something that really generates a ton of interest for them the way that
or
the
money
iPhone does. Right, exactly. It's not their focus. The phone is their focus, and I think that's really where everything's going to sit.
David?
It's going to be hard to be quick on this because I've been thinking a lot about this as well. I think it ultimately boils down to the future of the Apple TV interface, and how Apple imagines interacting with the TV. The thing is, currently the little silver remote does not scale well at all. So, if you had, even 5 or 10 more apps on your Apple TV, down to get to an app, and left, right. I mean, it's not an interface that really scales very well. I mean, it's already a pain just to get around and get to movies and everything like that. I mean, ultimately it's a lot better than most, TVs and TiVos and cable boxes and things like that. I mean, not knocking it as a general interface, but as something that you might expect to do more complex things with, it's definitely it's still kind of left in that very mouse paradigm, in that you're moving a selected state across information versus moving your selected state with the mouse. So anyways, not to get too deep on that. So if Apple, completely reimagines how we interact with the TV through, we like gestures, through, a camera, through voice activation, through whatever multitude of things that they could do, and potentially combining them all, then apps could potentially start to make a lot more sense and do, connect/we kinds of things. But even then, I think, there's a lot of challenge to think about what do I really want to have on this big screen. And if I have content, I pretty much always want that full screen. And if I'm watching a TV show, if I'm watching a basketball game, I don't want some like widget obscuring my view of the content. And, most of us who at this time have Apple TVs also have iPads and iPhones and other digital devices. And so, my theory on that has always been, these kind of widget things just don't make sense. Like if you want to know I see these Samsung commercials and TVs when you walk into Best Buy, it's like, if you want to know the weather, why don't you just look down at your dang iPhone? I mean, studies have already shown that people are watching TV with their digital devices. This is, I'm not imagining things to say, why don't you just look down at your iPhone? I think, that's what people are doing. I don't think people want these kind of widgets. So then you got to think, well, what do you want on the big screen? And Apple's done a pretty great job of moving that direction with AirPlay. Is that, when I take a bunch of pictures of my kids and I can sit down on the couch and show them and show my wife and show my family or show people who are over, or, the AirPlay photo stuff is really cool. And I don't think AirPlay has been explored as much as it even could have at this point, given the existing APIs, as far as, collaboration among apps. Because with this big screen sitting in the living room, I think what's compelling about it is not widgety stuff, but either content, full screen content, or these more collaborative experiences like games, even, collaborative information where you're doing something on your device, somebody else is doing it on their device, and that's being brought together on the screen, a la, educational type stuff. I mean, we actually have seen some really cool stuff in the education space, like Abilene Christian and some of those people have done some really fascinating stuff where you have a lot of devices in a room, and the data is coming together on the big screen, and that kind of stuff is compelling. And I think games are really compelling, and I think that space hasn't been explored nearly to the extent that it could be. Even something like Draw Something, like why couldn't that be a party game where it was actually on the big screen, where you're drawing live on your device, and it's happening on the big screen so that other people can see and guess. So I think even given our existing APIs, I think there's some really cool stuff that we could do. And that being the case, I don't know that Apple TV apps necessarily have to be anything more than what they already are, in that you have your existing iOS devices that can broadcast to this central screen. And so I think, if Apple can reduce latency and open up some other avenues there, I don't think we necessarily have to have apps on the TV the way most people are talking about apps being on the TV. Because, again, things like, MLB TV, well, that makes sense. That's a good app. But, we don't need 100,000 apps on our TV, especially when you can have those apps on your device and have those, sharing onto the TV.
Or just have your devices the second and third screen, so you don't have to clutter your TV with those apps.
Right, exactly. So, and I could go on and on about this So I'll end there. But I don't think it's going to be, if Apple does apps on the Apple TV, it's not going to be in the obvious way that people like Samsung are just throwing these widgets and web browsers on TV just because they can. I think if Apple truly does apps on the Apple TV, it's going to be a reimagining of what that can be, and it's probably going to be a much more collaborative thing among devices, not even just contained within the TV itself. So, anyways.
I'm going to agree with you. I mean, the way I think, there's this rumor going around that there'll be a full-fledged operating system because there's so many to-be-announced sessions at WWDC. And I agree with both of you. I don't think the Apple television or TV are a big enough revenue generator. Apple doesn't traditionally make a lot of money off apps anyway. And a television seems much more suited to channel apps rather than what we normally consider iOS apps at this point anyway. Like you already have a Netflix app on it. It's conceivable you'd have a Hulu or NBC or BBC, whatever app on it. And I agree completely. You don't necessarily want tweets or Facebook things popping up all over the game you're watching. That's why you have an iPhone or you have an iPad. So I could see Apple having more channel partners, maybe even gaming partners, and putting a select curated content on there. But I don't think we'll see anything like an iOS SDK or App Store, at least not soon. So my guess is those sessions are going to be reserved for stuff in iOS 6, like Seth was suggesting. And on that note, I am going to bring us... Do you have something else, Dave?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, so exactly what you're saying. Apple could, through the APIs they make available, and even through kind of their App Store guidelines like they have for iOS, they could, very significantly shape what's going to be allowed on this new platform. So I wouldn't completely write off the potential for an App Store, but I don't think it's going to, like you said, it's not going to be an App Store like iOS. It's I wouldn't even say curated, but dictated would probably be more appropriate, because I just don't think they're going to let a TV platform get cluttered up the way even iOS has been cluttered up.
You don't need text expander. You don't need. There's so many apps you just don't need on a TV.
Right, and I think iOS can work cluttered up because a lot of the crappy apps just get buried in the App Store, and that's okay. And even the apps that, apps like Launch Center, I mean, it's not for everybody, but you don't download it, you don't use it, you know, and then when you do, you open it, you use it, gets out of your way. I think they're gonna be much more careful on the TV platform to guard against very terrible experiences.
It's also a much more social platform than an iPhone and iPad is a very personal device, where a television is usually, enjoyed by a family or several people.
Yeah, or even just, what you're looking at on the TV, somebody can walk by your house and look in the window, or a spouse and kids walking in the room. And
Seth, stop twittering over my movie.
Yeah, it is a much more inherently open thing. You can have your iPhone, junked up and do whatever you feel like on it. But then, what's even compelling to do on the big screen? And I don't know, I have a ton of questions and
we'll do a roundtable just on the TV.
Yeah, we'll do another roundtable, and we'll see. I mean, I wouldn't put it past them though. It seems to make sense that if they are going to do, Apple TV related stuff, that if we were going to see hardware at WWDC, that's what we would see, with a 6-month lead time or something like that to prepare for it. So
roundtables are going to be our version of cowbells. We just need more roundtables. On that note, David, thank you very much for joining us. Where can we find out more about you?
Appcubby.com, Dr. Barnard on Twitter. I see my little lower third there. And I'm launching an app tomorrow.
Nice.
I'll give you a little preview. It's a timer app, and it actually is based on some of the big button principles that I was talking about during the show. So look for, hopefully you'll see some press on it tomorrow.
You'll see it on iMore tomorrow.
Around the web. All right, great. So look for that, and got a lot of great stuff in the works, actually. So keep an eye out.
Awesome. And Seth Clifford, what about you?
Seth Clifford on Twitter, here and on Iterate with Rene and Mark. And if you want to see some of the stuff we do, check out the site, nickelfish.com.
And you can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can find all of us at iMore. You can find all of our shows on mobilenations.com/shows. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for the chat room. You guys are fantastic as usual. And I think we'll continue this next week. There's just too much WWDC to pack into one show. So thank you guys very much and have an awesome evening.